Cathaoirleach of Kildare County Council, Dara Fitzpatrick, Oireachtas members, Cathal Berry, Martin Hayden and Bernard Durkin, Chief Executive Sonya Kavanagh, who will address us shortly. President of Kildare Chamber, Mairead Hennessy, will also be joining us shortly. Elected members, Director of Services, CEO Alan Shine will also be attending. He's got prior engagement this morning. CEO of Enterprise Ireland, Leo Clancy, who we'll also be hearing from later on. Distinguished speakers and guests, good morning and welcome to the Osprey Hotel for this year's Economic Forum. This morning is an opportunity for us all to review the current environment and make informed decisions about our objectives collectively for 2024. We have an excellent agenda with an eminent lineup of speakers. Justin Gleeson will also address us from the Aero Department in Maynooth University, as will Imelda Ray from Grant Thornton. These contributors are from the world of enterprise and economic development. Copies of the agenda are in front of you. And as I said, you will also hear from our guest speaker and moderator for the day, economist and analyst Jim Power, who will not only give his own insights in the global and national forecasts, but also take us through and facilitate some inspiring conversation from the sessions. We encourage as much interactions during the Q&A from the floor, because this event was put for business by business people, and the objectives of today is to better understand how collectively we can create a better business environment in County Kildare in 2024. You'll see on your table a coaster. On one side you'll see an invite to drop into the Enterprise and Economic Development team at a time of your own choice. Free coffee, Wi-Fi in a meeting area. That's an open invitation. This building across the foyer from the Osprey was a joint investment from Kildare County Council and Enterprise Ireland, and another investment into the ecosystem of entrepreneurship, and particularly in the tech sector. It is part of the K-Hub network, which you'll hear addressed later, and I'm sure my own director, Alan Dunny, will mention it in his few words. And we have some of the team from the network down at the back who will provide further information on what is available across County Kildare in terms of hubs. On the reverse, you'll see an invite to take part in the Local Enterprise and Community Plan Survey, another QR code. And again, our Director, Marion Higgins, will talk about that survey and the real importance of your input to hear your voice as business people into that very valuable plan for the next 5 years. Finally, before I ask my Chief Executive, Sonya Kavanagh, to join us to do the formal opening for this year's Economic Forum, I'd like to express gratitude to a number of people for their help in organising today's event. Martin Cullinan from All Events Audiovisual, who'll be looking after the sound and vision for today. The Osprey Hotel for this morning's venue, for the food and the warm hospitality that they always provide from us. Frame It Productions, Jim and Mike, and the videographer and photographer for today. And again, the stands, which will provide informative information for you at 11 o'clock, or indeed at 12:30, on the supports available to business. Tina Gannon and Rita Guiney are here, as well as her colleague from Enterprise Ireland. We've Chris and Lauren from the Connected Hubs, and of course, the Leo team and Economic Development team, who've put a huge amount of team effort into collectively putting together today. And I suppose there are always a few key people who take the lead, and I'd have to thank Doreen in particular, and indeed Connor and JP. Thank you very much. Again, thank you as always to the collaboration of Kildare Chamber, and indeed the guest speakers, both the panellists and the speakers themselves, for giving of their time freely today. Thank you so much for what I'm sure will be valuable insight into planning for 2024. So, my last job of the morning is to invite my Chief Executive, Sonya Kavanagh, Kildare County Council to address you.
Morning, everyone. Jacqui has done the hard job of all the introductions, so I'd just like to join with Jacqui in welcoming you all here this morning. During the course of the event, we'll be focusing on key themes that affect and impact on businesses in the current changing business environment, and how you, business owners, managers and entrepreneurs in County Kildare, can adapt to deliver growth and sustainability for your businesses and for our county. One of Kildare County Council's key priorities is economic development. We facilitate and support economic development by providing enabling infrastructure, sustainable and innovative land use zoning policies, and by working with other key stakeholders and government agencies such as IDA Enterprise Ireland, and of course we've mentioned County Kildare Chamber. We all share a pro-business approach, and we strive to make County Kildare attractive as a place to invest, to do business, to work, to live and to be educated. Today's event in association with the Chamber is timely as we review progress on Kildare's economic strategy towards 2025, and we're just about to have access to detailed census data. I know I'm very interested to hear Justin's contribution from Aero later. Kildare County Council has completed its county development plan. That's our spatial planning plan for the county, and we're in the process of creating our new local economic and community plan. That's a 5-year plan that will bring together objectives for both community and economic development. And having consulted with yourselves, the business community, we'll specify actions that will make the most of Kildare's many assets and strengths. We're also keenly aware of the need to promote and support balanced development in our county and in our region. The varied nature of the initiatives described here today will illustrate how growth can be facilitated and supported in many innovative ways to attract new business, to support existing businesses, to support town centre development and regeneration, and increase competitiveness. I really hope you can stay with us for the rest of the morning, as we've curated a programme of speakers to inform, to inspire and to engage you as key leaders and decision makers to take a proactive approach to business planning and to face future challenges with confidence. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator and our keynote speaker, economist, writer and podcaster, Mr. Jim Power.
Thank you very much, Sonya, for that introduction. Welcome, everybody, to the Kildare Economic Forum. I'm going to be moderating the sessions over the remainder of the morning, but the first thing I want to do is basically, Ireland is a small open economy operating in a global environment. Kildare is an economy operating in a national context. So what I want to do really is set the global and the domestic economic backdrop against which Kildare will be operating over the coming years. And I just want to start off by giving you a little bit of an overview of what's happening at a global level. The last 3 years have been extraordinary, putting it mildly. We had, from March 2020 onwards, the dramatic shock from COVID. And just as we thought we were returning to some semblance of normality at the beginning of last year, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there has been massive economic and financial and indeed political disruption in the global economy over the last few years. And there have been many things that have flown from that. Obviously, I think the thing that's been most visible has been the re-emergence over the last 18 months of inflation, because when I studied economics in UCD in the 1980s, we did a course called The Economics of Stagflation. And that stagflation describes an environment of slow growth, high inflation. And that came on the back of the 2 oil price shocks in the 1970s, which a few people in the room would remember. Deputy Durkin. So we're back there again for 40 years. That fell flat, didn't it? For 40 years, we lived through an environment. We go back a long way, so I can say that. We've lived sort of for at least 3 decades in an environment of totally flat inflation. And in fact, the lack of inflation was the challenge, particularly over the last decade. But in the last 2 years, inflation has come back, and we're looking at the highest levels of inflation now in about 40 years in many jurisdictions. And central bankers have reacted aggressively to that. We've seen pretty dramatic interest rate tightening over the last 12 months in the case of Ireland and Europe. Starting at the end of July last year, the European Central Bank has increased rates by 4.25%, which is a pretty dramatic tightening of interest rate policy, despite the fact that rates were coming from historically low levels. And all of that stuff is having a huge impact on the global economy and economic activity everywhere, but particularly in Europe and the United Kingdom, has slowed dramatically. And in fact, the European economy particularly is now skirting along the bottom, basically on the brink of recession. And that's something that central bankers are not unhappy about, because that's what they have sought to achieve, because they recognized that the one way of preventing inflation from becoming a problem like the 1980s was to engineer a slowdown in the global economy to try and get inflation back under control. It's a blunt tool, but it's the tool that's been implemented. One of the features of the global landscape has been, despite all of those global headwinds from geopolitical developments, inflation, rising interest rates, COVID, and so on, labour markets everywhere remain very, very tight. We have a 4.1% unemployment rate here, 6.4% in the euro area, which is the lowest we've seen since the euro was created back in 1999. The United States, it's about 3.6%, 3.7% at the moment. So labour markets everywhere very tight. And that poses, okay, at one level, having high employment, low levels of unemployment is socially very positive, and indeed economically. But from a central banker's perspective, it's a challenge because it feeds into the whole inflation narrative. And secondly, from a business perspective, it's a challenge because recruitment, retention of labour has been a major issue. I guess the thing that would worry one most about the global backdrop, and economists are always being slagged off about their inability to forecast the future, I would always counter that by saying, how in the name of God can you forecast anything in an environment where we have to deal with political systems? And at a global geopolitical level, over the last, since 2016, basically, we've seen massive disruption, which is continuing. You look at the Ukraine-Russian situation, you look at the relationship between China and the United States with Taiwan in the middle. I could go on, but the global geopolitical backdrop at the moment is incredibly challenging, volatile, and potentially scary. And of course, political developments have economic consequences. We should never forget that. You know, we saw in the UK in 2016, mad politics delivering Brexit, which is an unmitigated disaster and will always be thus. So it just shows that political events do have economic consequences. We should never forget that. And of course, the final piece of the global environment is the whole climate change agenda. And I think for anybody who doubted the severity of the climate change challenge, what has happened this summer in terms of weather events and so on just shows you there is something very, very significant changing. So it's an uncertain global economic backdrop. There's no doubt about that. And for a small open economy like Ireland, that does present challenges. Looking at the domestic situation here, there is a narrative out there from some quarters that Ireland is a failed economic entity. It's not. The economy has been performing pretty strongly. Tax revenues really strong. The Department of Finance has consistently warned about the vulnerability of the corporation tax side, because we've seen an absolute windfall of corporation tax coming in over the last few years. Last year, we collected 23 billion, and 10 years ago, we'd have been lucky to collect 4 billion on the corporation tax side. But one of the challenges there is that 10 companies account for 57% of that corporation tax take. And of course, the vulnerability is if any of those companies were to experience difficulties, we have a problem. And in the latest Exchequer returns to the end of August, we saw that the corporation tax take was $1 billion down on August of last year. But, and I would never jump to any conclusions based on 1 month's data, but it does send out a message that this windfall corporation tax take just cannot continue indefinitely. And the message for government then, of course, is that spending money on the back of a tax windfall that could disappear at some stage is a risky strategy. And we discovered that back in 2007, 2008, when the construction sector collapsed. The labour market, incredibly strong, 2.643 million people working here, which is a record high by a mile, an unemployment rate of 4.1%, which is virtual full employment. The consumer side of the economy is holding up reasonably well, but cost of living pressures, rising interest rates, and in fact, in the year to August, the average mortgage cost was up by about 52%. So the personal sector in the aggregate is experiencing some pressures. There's no doubt about that. And we're seeing some slowdown in consumer spending, but certainly there is no collapse in consumer spending. The personal balance sheet in the economy at an aggregate level is very strong. And this was one of the problems 10 years ago, or 2006, 2007 specifically, a little bit more than 10 years ago at this stage. The personal balance sheet was seriously flawed here. High levels of personal borrowing, very low levels of personal saving. It is the very opposite at the moment. Personal borrowing has fallen significantly over the last decade, and household savings at 152 billion are now at the highest level we've ever seen. I know throwing out these aggregate statistics may not tell the whole story, because there are certainly segments of the personal sector that are really stressed at the moment. There are other segments that are doing very, very well. But in the aggregate, the household balance sheet is pretty healthy. Housing is obviously the biggest challenge. I think in terms of priorities from a social and economic and a political perspective, housing is where it's at. And I guess at a national level, I fail to understand why housing has not been afforded the sort of crisis/emergency status that COVID was given back in March 2020. It is the biggest issue facing us as a society and as an economy, and indeed the political system. This is the employment story. You could certainly describe Ireland as a mean, lean, green job-creating machine. The employment performance has been absolutely phenomenal. This is the inflation challenge. You can see out there on the right-hand side, there's been a significant blip over the last 18 months. Starting to moderate a little bit, but inflation running at 6.3% at the moment, is way above a desirable level of inflation. And indeed, that's why interest rates are probably going to rise a little bit further, because this is common at a European level. It's not just an Irish situation. Interest rates are going to rise a little bit further, and I think will remain at elevated levels until central bankers are totally satisfied that inflation has been brought under control. Way too many statistics here. Sort of slide one should never use, but the slides will be available. You can see there that energy has had a huge impact on the inflation front over the last 12 months, and food also. But we're now starting to see other elements, particularly in the services sector. Service sector inflation is running at about 9.5% at the moment, whereas goods inflation is running at about 2.5%. So there's a lot of inflationary pressures in the system that will take some time to bring under control. This is the national residential housing unit completions going back to 2011. And between 2011 and 2022, we delivered an average of 13,614 new houses per annum. So basically, for a decade, we stopped building houses. And against the background of a growing population, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why we have a housing problem. is because, quite simply, supply has not matched natural demand, and that is obviously a significant problem. This is the Kildare story in terms of housing completions, pretty much mirroring what happened at a national level for a number of years, very low levels of completions. But in the last few years, there has been a significant improvement. And I'm not going to dwell on that because later speakers and panelists will be talking more about the housing situation. So to wrap up, what are the issues facing us as a national economy? Well, the external growth challenges I've mentioned. The global economy is stressed at the moment. Europe is flat. China is in serious trouble. The United States is doing a little bit better than the rest, but still, there is definitely a global growth challenge. We have an economic concentration risk here in the sense that I mentioned the 57% of corporation tax coming from 10 multinational companies. But the multinational employment contribution here, 305,000 people employed directly. For every one job in a multinational, there's about 0.8 of a job supported in the rest of the economy. So the foreign direct investment piece is incredibly important. And that is why it is absolutely essential to make sure that the environment here nationally and indeed at a local level in Kildare remains as conducive as possible to foreign direct investment. We're seeing some pressures on the global technology sector. We've seen a lot of the big tech companies over the last year shedding a lot of labour. Ireland is not proving immune to that. And there's two ways of looking at that. The positive is that for sectors of the economy that could not compete for IT workers with big tech in the last couple of years, there is now a major opportunity. And indeed, we are seeing that most of the tech workers being displaced are being soaked up into other parts of the economy. That's the positive piece. The negative piece is that if the global tech companies are experiencing a slowdown, that obviously has implications for profitability and for Ireland's corporation tax take. So that's why government needs to be very, very careful about managing expenditure. But I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm a conservative, slightly right-of-centre economist. The global corporation tax agenda is important. Two elements to that. One is a minimum corporation tax rate of 15% for companies with turnover in excess of 750 million. That is imminent. I think that will have minimal impact on us, and in fact, it could actually boost corporation tax in the short term. I think the bigger issue is the Pillar 1 of that OECD deal, which is, and it's still some way down the line because politically it's proving difficult to get it across the line. But what it basically means is that multinational companies will end up paying more tax in the jurisdiction in which they do business, where they sell stuff, rather than where their balance sheet is located. So that has implications for Ireland. It's not the end of the world, it certainly isn't, but what it does mean is that a key part of our competitive advantage in the FDI space, i.e. taxation, is going to come under some pressure. So that's why it is absolutely essential that at a national level and indeed at a local level that we do whatever we need to do to make sure that the other elements of our competitive package remain as positive as possible. So within that, infrastructure is really important. IT capability is really important. The skilled labour force and investment in education, probably top of the pile from my perspective. Housing is obviously a crucial one, and we're seeing more and more soundings now from people in the IDA and elsewhere saying that housing is now becoming a significant impediment to attracting employment into areas. So therein lies a major opportunity for a county like Kildare, for example, given the particular problems in the Dublin market at the moment. So these are, and of course the other important one is public services, health, education and so on, water, really important. So we need to work on all of those issues and areas in the context of these global corporation tax pressures. Housing, as I said, is in my view, the most important element of national competitiveness at the moment. Socially, economically, politically, it is an incredible challenge and threat to Ireland's well-being at the moment. If we sort housing, we can sort a lot of problems in our economy. The climate agenda is absolutely crucial, and I hate devoting sort of 30 seconds to it, but you know, at the level of the company and at the level of the national economy, the whole ESG agenda, environmental, social governance, with the environmental part of particular significance, is going to dominate and has to dominate the economic and the national economic and the business environment into the future. Demographics, Ireland, and I know Justin is going to be telling you a lot about demographics in a Kildare context in a second, but Ireland is kind of unique in an EU context at the moment in that we're still seeing ongoing strong growth in population. We have a very young population, but it is aging. There's no doubt about that. So significant challenges from a growing population and from an aging population in terms of provision services and so on. And going back to the housing point, you know, the fact that we stopped building houses for a decade, despite the fact that the population was growing strongly, I think marks a remarkable lack of foresight and policy failure from policymakers in this country. And I guess the final point then would be politics. We have an election due before February 2025. My local Fine Gael TD told me recently it was going to be October of next year, but that's now being denied. But whenever it's going to happen before February of next year, who knows what will happen. But I think from a business perspective, people need to plan for the possibility of significant change in the political environment. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but you know, one needs to plan for changes in the political environment. And you know, time will obviously tell. There are no certainties in the world of politics, but you know, we need to build in political developments into our national planning process. So I have 1 minute left, which is opportune. This is a blatant commercial for a podcast I do twice a week called The Other Hand. Sign up and tell your friends, okay? But I hope I've given you some sense about the global and the national economic context for Kildare, and I hope it feeds down into the discussion we are going to have over the remainder of the morning. And thank you very much for your attention.